All right. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Reverend Richard Nordgren, Associate Member of St. John's Lutheran Church in beautiful Greenpoint, Brooklyn, which is sponsoring this series of Bible studies called The Many Faces of God. This is the 21st class in the series where we've been looking through the Old Testament text to see how God is presented to us, what ways God self-reveals, and how that affects actions in our relationship, with our Creator. 2 weeks ago, when we were working through the book of Job, which I think is one of the more germinal and transformational books in the Old Testament. We finished up, our review of Job with a lot of questions yet to be discussed. Really heavy questions, really important questions. But in the sequence of books that we are following, I should mention that we are following the order of books that's found in the Hebrew Bible rather than in the Christian Bible. And following the book of Job in the Hebrew edition of the canon, we had the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon as it's sometimes called, and the book of Ruth, both of which were a much needed break from the heavy tone and the tormenting questions that we left Job with. The two books provided a much needed mood lift for us and those who study it. Tonight we're looking at three different books that follow Song of Solomon and Ruth, and they are Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. All three of them are fairly short and were written in different historical periods. Lamentations is thought to have been written by a student of Jeremiah, who was a prophet in the fading days of Judah's glory before it was destroyed and uprooted. And Lamentations' mentor, Jeremiah, had anticipated that this is what was going to happen because of the sins of Israel. We do not know the name of the student of Jeremiah who wrote Lamentations, but he's certainly in the same ilk as his master, but probably written a generation or so after Jeremiah was completed. That would place it sometime in the 5th century BCE. About a century after that, well into the post-exilic period, the author of Ecclesiastes, sometimes called the preacher, but otherwise equally anonymous, wrote a book which falls into the wisdom tradition. And the third one, the book of Esther, was probably the latest of the three that we will be studying tonight. It's set, while Israel was in part of the Persian Empire, but in all likelihood, it was authored, maybe a century after the fall of the Persian Empire. And so most scholars will place the composition of Esther into the 3rd century BCE. So it's pretty late of the books of the Old Testament, as is Daniel, that we'll be looking at next time. So let's start with Lamentations. But let me pause here and ask if there's any questions that you've been pondering since our study of Job, or when we were into the Song of Solomon or and Ruth. Anything that you wanted to bring out and ask about? No? Okay. Well, too bad. Yeah. Let's jump right into Lamentations then. Okay. To get a sense of what it's like, I'm going to ask for somebody to read the first 4 verses of the first chapter.
I'll read.
Thank you.
The first verse makes me think of what New York City was like with the onset of the pandemic, you know.
Mhm.
How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks among all her lovers. She has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. Judah has gone into exile with suffering and hard servitude. She now lives among the nations and finds no resting place. Her pursuers have all overtaken her in the midst of her distress. The roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to the festivals. All her gates are desolate, her priests groan, her young girls grieve, and her lot is bitter.
Okay. Thank you. Uh, this book, Lamentations, is very much like the lament psalms that we studied earlier. Uh, it's a tale of grief, of loss, of loneliness, and of difficulty with adjustment to a new reality. In Lamentations, there is one major difference from the laments we found in Psalms. The lament psalms are about the trials and tribulations of the individual. Whoever is casting forth the prayer, is speaking on his own behalf or her own behalf. But the author of Lamentations, is writing on behalf of all of Judah, of all of Israel. Um, the the point that the author is making is that the whole country, the whole people, the whole nation, all of them, have suffered. Not everybody has gone into exile, but everybody knows that Jerusalem was ravaged. Not everyone was killed, in battle, but everyone knows that the temple was destroyed and desecrated. Um, Not everyone lost, all their belongings, but everyone knew that the best and the brightest of Israel's nation was ripped out of its homeland and taken into exile in Babylon. Everybody had experienced grief in one way or another. And so the author is expressing the experience of loss of the entire nation. The author of Lamentations, is a good student, in that he has incorporated and integrated into his own thoughts, the insights and understandings of his teacher. And we can see that in the next section of Lamentations. So I'm going to ask for another reader, and this is chapter 1, verses 5 through 9.
I can read it.
Thank you, Tess.
Hold on. Her foes have become the masters, her enemies prosper, because the Lord has made her suffer for the multitude of her transgressions. Her children have gone away captives before the foe. From daughter Zion has departed all her majesty. Her princes have become like stags that find no pasture. They fled without strength before the pursuer. Jerusalem remembers, in the days of her affliction and wandering, all the precious things that were hers in days of old, when her people fell into the hand of the foe, and there was no one to help her. The foe looked on mocking over her downfall. Jerusalem sinned grievously, so she has become a mockery. All who honored her despise her, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns her face away. Her uncleanness was in her skirts. She took no thought of her future. Her downfall was appalling, with none to comfort her. O Lord, look at my affliction, for the enemy has triumphed.
Okay, thank you. This section here, indicates that the author of Lamentations certainly concurred with his master, that Israel had got exactly what it deserved. The sins had become so egregious, so blatant, and so unrelenting, that everything that happened to Israel, everything that happened in Judah, was the reasonable and logical consequence of the sins of disloyalty and unfaithfulness for God. The author of Lamentations does not make much point of the transgressions against other human beings. The focus is primarily on what Israel did to offend God by being unfaithful and going after idols. I think we can also conclude with the scholars who place Lamentations not long after Jeremiah was written, and before the full force of the loss that occurred in the time of exile could have been appreciated. Second Isaiah had instilled hope into the hearts of the exiles and those who were waiting for their return by anticipating and even promising a future which would be glorious, full restoration, and even greater restoration than what had been lost. If the author of Lamentations had been writing maybe 50 years after he actually put pen to paper, he might not have been so harsh, because in spite of all the efforts of the Israelites, there was very little progress. It was a slow slog to rebuild Jerusalem. It was a long time before the temple was restored and purified. The resources were lacking. There was not enough money. There was not enough people. There was not enough equipment. And in spite of the pleading, in spite of the demands of the leaders, there just was not the capacity for the restoration of the city and its defenses, the temple and its services there. They just could not be happening. And if the author of Lamentations had been aware of what the future would hold, I suspect that he would not have been so harsh and accusatory. I'd like you to, let me jump back there. Megan, I'd like you to do a reading next in the 4th chapter of Lamentation, verses 11 through 20.
Okay. The Lord gave full vent to his wrath. He poured out his hot anger and kindled a fire in Zion that consumed its foundations. The kings of the earth did not believe, nor did any of the inhabitants of the world, that foe or enemy could enter the gates of Jerusalem. It was for the sins of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests who shed blood of the righteous in the midst of her. Blindly they wandered through the streets, so defiled with blood that no one was able to touch their garments. Away, unclean, people shouted at them, away, away, do not touch So they became fugitives and wanderers. It was said among the nations, they shall stay here no longer. The Lord himself has scattered them. He will regard them no more. No honor was shown to the priests, no favor to the elders. Our eyes failed, ever watching vainly for help. We were watching eagerly for a nation that could not save. They dogged our steps so that we could not walk in our streets. Our end drew near, our days were numbered, for our end had come. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles in the heavens. They chased us on the mountains. They lay in wait for us in the wilderness. The Lord's anointed, the breath of our life, was taken in their pits. The one of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations.
Okay, thank you. This passage, like many others, is an interpretation of historical events. What is absent from the text is the prophetic enunciation, "Thus saith the Lord." The author of Lamentations is reviewing the recent past, has come to conclusions about the meaning of events, and is proclaiming those conclusions. God is not speaking through this person, so he cannot be titularly called a prophet. He is a historian, if you will, who has studied the events that ravaged Israel and came to a conclusion that Israel deserved it. But we need to go back to Job and ask the question, why is God now silent after all these horrible things have happened? And if God is to remain silent, how are we to know what to expect from God and to understand what God requires of us? What had been happening, in the exile and certainly in the post-exilic period is that various, shall we call them, denominations had crystallized and taken form and had advanced, one interpretation of history versus another, which had advanced a certain way of life as opposed to another, had emphasized religious rituals and rites as opposed to ethical considerations and requirements for justice and mercy. God is not making it clear which of these alternatives are favored by God, and so we are left to look at the people who were dealing with those issues at that time and saying, how are they going to figure out what God favors most, is most important to God, and how are we going to figure out what God wants us to do and to be? Is God going to be silent forever? It was
I think though, Richard, that one of the traditions of the church that has developed over a very long period of time is that we read scripture in very broad ways.
Yeah.
From the particular to the broad, and that there is Old and New Testament in all genres of scripture. There is always a critique of leadership. And here, the sin that is visited is because of the failures of the prophets and the priests. The prophets and the priests did not do their job, and because we failed, there are now consequences, and the consequences are horrible.
Yes.
Horrid. And scripture is, when a person who is called or elected or appointed to a position is doing a really good job, you don't hear a lot, right?
Yeah.
Prophets don't show up when things are going great. Prophets don't show up and go, woohoo. They don't.
No.
You know, so scripture in that sense is one-sided. So there, you don't have the opposite of Lamentations. You don't have Happy Days, the book, in scripture. So it's skewed that way. But I think that God, if we read broadly and read over time, that God has a preference for a kind of leadership, and that God has this preferential option for the poor.
Mm-hmm.
And that when we are attentive to the needs of the least and the last, the marginalized, the oppressed, the widow and the orphan, that when we are attentive to those things, then there's not these horrible consequences. And if we take that lens and put it on secular society, if we look at when societies, democratic ones, capitalistic ones, socialist, whatever they are, if we take that hermeneutic lens and look at societies and we say, okay, when was this country strongest, happiest, and best? It's always been when we have been attentive to the basic needs and rights of everybody, not the few. And that when we get a more egalitarian reality, we're better. But when we get this hierarchy, it really goes to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah.
And, I think that's true under Muslim rule in Muslim countries. When Muslims are following the best practices that have been developed about lending money and how to deal with financial realities, and everybody has enough, you have a pretty good society.
Yeah.
But when you Iran used to be an amazingly metropolitan, great country in a lot of ways. And then they overturned it and decided to go fundamentalist and stupid. And now we have what we have. So I think this lens can be superimposed on every single historic reality, any kind of society. But I think that it demonstrates from a secular as well as from a religious view that God has a preference for how we order ourselves. And that ordering is better for us. But because of sin and greed and incompetency and meanness and stupidity, we don't do it, even though we could.
Yeah. Okay. I have no argument with what you just expounded. Okay? What I will say is the answer that you've given did not fully develop and did not have wide acceptance until Jesus. Up until that
You don't
time,
think like Amos, Micah, Malachi, Zephaniah, you don't think?
But in the post-exilic period, those folks were old news.
Yeah.
They had their day, and there was various shall we call them denomination or sects that were promoting one point of view or the other, and there was no mechanism for adjudicating the truth claims of one group versus another. So it was unsettled. If the Sadducees happened to be in the ascendancy, they could ride roughshod over the moralists. If the moralists got the bit between their teeth, they could enforce fairness rules. But as far as the church is concerned, I don't think we came to a conclusion of what God prefers until Jesus had come and gone. Well, I think the period that I'm focusing on tonight, has some key resonances with what you are talking about in your sermon today. Like there are times when it seems like God is nowhere present. And I would suggest that for a long period of time, the Israelites, were wondering, is God abandoned us forever and ever? The silence of God is killing us spiritually. We are going back to what we know how to do, most proficiently, because we don't have God with us, to either speak to us directly or, through authoritative spokespeople. So in the post-exilic period, it was a time of mourning, not just of the destruction of Jerusalem, the desecration of the temple, but I think there was also deep mourning because it seemed like God also, had been lost. Yeah. So, okay. You want to add anything on to your comments? Okay. Well, then let's move to the book of Ecclesiastes. And for the geezers in the crowd, you probably remember a song by the Birds, that it was a direct quotation from the book of Ecclesiastes. And Ecclesiastes, or sometimes it's called the preacher, is an anonymous source. We have no idea who this person was, what life was like for this individual, what he did for a living, or who his grandmother's birthday was. But he fits into the wisdom literature as a generic class of authorship. But he departs, in very significant ways, from the wisdom literature that we looked at in Proverbs. I think this preacher, Ecclesiastes, who had a tendency to give equal weight to all sides of every question that was brought before him, did so because he wasn't given a definitive, message to give to his people, and perhaps, with undue scrupulousness, perhaps with a high regard for integrity, character, he felt it would be improper to just give one point of view. So he gave everybody's point of view, which means that the author of Ecclesiastes, basically did not like his calling, to be a sage, to be a provider of sound advice. We get a sense of that, from reading in the first chapter, verses 2 through 11. Pastor, did you take that one on?
Tell me again what you want.
Chapter 1, verses 2 through 11.
Yes. Vanity of vanities, says the teacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? A generation comes and a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and the sun goes down and hurries to the place where it rises. The wind blows to the south and goes round to the north. Round and round goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. All streams run to the sea, but the sea is not full. To the place where the streams flow, there they continue to flow. All things are wearisome, more than one can express. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There is nothing new under the sun.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, that was it?
No, I was just commenting on that passage, because I like it.
Yeah. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been in the ages before us. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them.
Okay.
Here ends the depression.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a very great sense in here that there's nothing new. We've seen this all before. Life is a endless repetition of cycles. And there's no real forward movement, or development as a culture. There's no forward movement or along the moral arc of history. Um, you know, People are born into a world which is going to be pretty much the same, as it will be when they die. And it'll be pretty much the same as it was when their grandparents were alive. If you can see that things need to be changed, if you see that there's need for improvement in the moral standards of the behavior of individuals and even a whole people, this is a pretty depressing weight that you have to deal with. It's basically saying, don't get too worked up about your ideas that you can make people better. Accept the fact that it is what it is, and no matter how much effort you put into it, it's not going to be all that much different after you stop trying. So the author of Ecclesiastes was basically not enthralled at all with wisdom as a means of achieving the good life. And in fact, he is far more cognizant of the limitations and restrictions that we all have on what we can accomplish. Cass, would you read the next passage after the one that Pastor just read? That'd be chapter 1, verses 12 through 18.
Sure. I, the teacher, when king over Israel and Jerusalem, applied my mind to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to human beings to be busy with. I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see, all is vanity and a chasing after wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to myself, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceived that this also is but a chasing after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow.
Oh, that's a really uplifting, heartfelt message, isn't it? Like I say, unlike the author of Proverbs, he was not enthralled with the task set before him, to look and examine, study, and conclude, what people can accomplish in having a good life. There's one other thing, that I think is important to read from, this book. It was written after the reality of the new reality of Israel's situation. It was pretty doggone clear to everybody. The restoration was going to be slow and difficult, and the outcome it was not going to be magnificent or majestic. And what also is in here, but needs some digging out, is the fact that Ecclesiastes, reckoned that once Israel had returned from exile, there's not talk anymore about its unfaithfulness. In fact, people are urged to be, even more faithful than they have been faithful. It's not a case of them pouring after, false gods or, setting up idols in the corner of their homes. These are people that the preacher regards as being, truly loyal to God, and yet their circumstances have gotten worse. Anything, they remain a vassal nation. They pay taxes to a foreign government. Their freedom of action is restricted by what their overlords will allow them to do. They had not been unfaithful to God, and yet their situation in life was getting worse and worse. Now, the preacher, who was cognizant of this, took all different points of view on this conclusion. But he never comes out and says anything definitive. But he does come to a position nonetheless. And it is a position that is very different from the theology of Deuteronomy, and very different from the theological implications of the wisdom literature as a whole. Both Deuteronomy and the wisdom literature, rested on the conviction that consequences followed actions. If you did something good, there was going to be a good outcome. If you did something bad, there was going to be a bad outcome. Yeah, there may be some delays between behavior and consequence, but it was firmly rooted in the thinking of most of the authors of the books of the Old Testament that acts had consequences. But the preacher, goes off in another direction altogether, and makes a clean cut between human actions and subsequent rewards or punishment. What he offers instead is these endless cycles, where efforts to make improvements, are not necessarily rewarded, where bad behavior is not necessarily punished. Instead, in its place, there's these endless cycles that somehow we get trapped into, and sometimes we wind up being enriched, and sometimes we wind up being deprived. And unlike the laments, and unlike some of the earlier prophets, this preacher accepted that was the way things were, and voiced no complaints against God. But neither was God praised. You can read through all of Ecclesiastes, and there's no outpouring of affection, no outpouring of thanks and gratitude. What we see, instead, is the conclusion presented to us in so many different ways, that God is inscrutable, and just accept your fate, whatever life may brings to you, because God now is unpredictable. And this may be the explanation of why he offered so many different points of view, thinking that if God is unpredictable, it would be cruel to give just one point of view, one piece of advice. And what is interesting is that this was a direct challenge to the self-revelation of God in the covenant at Sinai. But God let this challenge go unanswered. As far as we know, the preacher incurred no reward or no punishment for advancing a point of view which was profoundly different from the historic trajectory of Israel's self-understanding and its understanding of its relationship with God. Let me pause there at Ecclesiastes and see if there's any thoughts or reflections that you'd like to share. Megan?
I mean, I don't know. I think that like this kind of, I like the whole, nothing's new.
Mhm.
It seems like very like straightforward and to the point. Um, like I'm not seeing anything here where I'm kind of like, I don't know. It just seems like it's a very level-headed way to, look at things, like that there's nothing new, and you kind of keep doing the same thing and just in different, time periods, and you see like those cycles with certain things in history. Like revolutions, and then, things, after the revolution, then there's a period of, prosperity, and then, people go back to thinking that they're smarter than everybody else, and then they shoot themselves in the foot, and then, then another revolution starts, and you just keep going through it and through it and through it. So I while this is very like straightforward and to the point, like I do actually agree with, this. Um, so yeah, that's all I got to say.
Okay, yeah. Any other comments or reflections?
I will say that, Megan, I like how you sort of gave me that reminder of like how, like throughout history, like things just always like ebb and flow, because like sometimes when I read this, there were moments where I was just like, it can't just be the status quo. Like, no, you know, um, we have to challenge things sometimes, but like, yeah, I just liked Megan's reminder that there is this ebb and flow where there are times where we do have to accept where we are. Um, even, individually, like not just like as a nation or just like, as a collective, like even in our own individual lives, it is just for our mental health sake, just sort of, accept where we are and just sort of like take a breather once in a while, I think, um, is what I'm getting out of this, is just like a good reminder to sort of be like, okay, let's just chill out for today and like explore this again tomorrow. Um, yeah.
Yeah.
I do think though that the author's pessimism, um, while I there are days that I'm like, yeah, man. But I think that we can demonstrate in a way that there has been progress in humanity over the 20th century was one of the most brutal centuries in all of history. It was horrible. Um, and you know, are we going to ultimately learn from that? No, we'll do it again. We'll repeat a lot of the things. We really will. But we did so much progress. We were so interrupted by technology over the last 25, 30 years that it took us light years ahead. Um, now there's this entire conversation about, can we have egalitarian spaces on the internet, or is it all going to be Jeff Bezos deciding what we want, and things like this. But humans have been able to create these kind of egalitarian communities, not eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die, that kind of fatalism. But I think that this, and I would go back to God on this, that God has a plan for the fullness of time. I wish the directions were clearer. And part of that plan is that the kingdom of God comes here more fully. And so we have seen this change in women's rights in this country. Now, there are those who are trying to claw all that back and would happily have us all married, pregnant, barefoot, unable to have our own credit cards, unable to vote, all of that stuff. Like The Handmaid's Tale is somebody's wet dream, essentially. But that we have made that kind of progress. That, William Smith has said, white people today are the nicest white people in history, right? Even with all the stuff that's going on, it's not that there's more brutality, it's just filmed, right? We can just see it now. And seeing it changes us. I'm more inclined to change something that I see and witness and I'm touched by. Emmett Till, when they buried him in an open casket, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, all of these things. So I think that, however haltingly and with great disappointment, I think that humans have changed just a modicum, which is more than we could have hoped for. But I do think that we have been changed. I think in other parts of the world, where where misogyny is codified, that they're just going backwards as fast as they possibly can. But in places where misogyny is being destroyed and there's equality, I think that we are making these incremental, tiny, glacier-like changes. But I think we are doing it. At least I hope so.
Yeah.
I try not to have a hermeneutic of only pessimism. Every now and then I got to have just a little bit of hope.
Yeah. I love the eloquence of the preacher, the Ecclesiastes. There's stuff in there that just is, marvelous rhetoric, composition. But I rebel against, his central message that, don't bother to try and make things different. You're just going to run your head against a brick wall, and you're going to smash it open like some pumpkin. I rebel against that idea.
I had somebody say to me, my first 16 years of ordained ministry, here in the Bronx, just daily trauma every day. And I finally got to the point where I described it as, my ministry feels like I'm in the middle of the Hudson River with two hands trying to stop the river from flowing. That's how ineffective it felt most of the time. And I think, there is a place for Ecclesiastes, but I think that as people of faith, that yes, acceptance is part of it, but also we have to be restless and unsatisfied with people being hungry. That's just, you can't kind of go, oh, that sucks to be you. No. No.
I'll pray for you.
God, I hate that. You're on my prayer list. I'm on your shit. That's what that means.
On the other hand, even though I rebel against the fatalism of Ecclesiastes, there's the recognition that every time a child is born, we've got a potential monster in our hands, and human nature is remarkably resilient. It is baked into the genes, and it is so difficult to. As you were pointing out, Pastor, the changes have been made. Women can now vote. Blacks can vote. The Jim Crow laws have been, taken off the books. There has been progress. And for me, what that means is that, as parents and society goes about, enculturating and indoctrinating and civilizing these little savages that we give birth to, we have a higher standard over a period of time than we once had. Now, that does not mean we're, free from the potential to backslide.
Right.
I think we've seen that in the last 6 years, that in this country and other places. But with all the advances that have been made, it changes the benchmark against which parents and society, can measure how effectively it's raising the next generation. So with that, I would like to move on to Esther, our concluding book for tonight. Esther is a book that fits into this section that we've been studying. Fits in very well. It's historical fiction, but it also has a message. You read it and you see, it takes place in the Persian court, but more likely, the historical setting that the author had in mind, was centuries later when the Greeks, had destroyed the Persians and had taken control of much of the known world. The Seleucid Empire, which is one of the successors to the empire that Alexander the Great created, which was centered in the Levant and modern Iraq, was the regional regnant power. And it was the power that the Jews were most worried about. They had dealt with foreign overlords on many, many occasions, but their overlords had largely been uninterested in their religious and cultural traditions, and did not bother them when it came to worship and the acts which go along with that. The Greeks, on the other hand, were intent on imposing their own culture on people that they ruled. And they did it with a lot of vigor. And they clearly knew what they were doing. So even though the story is set in the Persian Empire, we're actually dealing with a theme that was of great concern when the Greeks were in power much later, because the Greeks were intent on eradicating the Jewish distinctives, their way of living, their communal nature. And if they could not eradicate those distinctive things, they would eradicate the people who practiced them. Esther and the Jews who were in this court, the historical fiction, were very much aware that they were a non-privileged minority, and that they had to be constantly vigilant and aware of what was going on, and being able to use their wits in order to prevent the extermination of their people. Survival was the uppermost concern, and people needed to do what people needed to do to ensure their own protection. In the book of Esther, God is not even mentioned. In some of the earlier texts that we've studied recently, I've said that whatever was going on historically was the picture, and it was surrounded by a frame called God. In Esther, God doesn't even provide a frame, for what happens. Esther, and presumably, others who were in a position like Mordecai to, affect the outcome, did nothing, to reveal their religious identity. Esther, even when she was given the opportunity to worship, didn't take that opportunity. I guess she figured that it was more important to remain religiously agnostic or anonymous than it was to pray and to perform ritual services in public. And what we read in Esther is that she led the pack in that regard. For the Jews mourned, but there's no indication that they prayed. Which means that for the survival of this small nation, which was under the threat of a very powerful and dominant regime, what counted most in their thinking was how they could play their assets the best, given the cards that they were dealt, and make use of their talents for the goal of preventing genocide. And this they were able to do. Israel had faced a similar dire situation during the time of the Exodus, where the Pharaoh wanted to eradicate all the Jews, particularly the babies. And in that situation, in Exodus, God was the chief actor, the super warrior. But in Esther, God is not involved in any way that we can discern in the planning, the execution, and the completion of a plan that saved Israel from annihilation. I guess if we have any takeaway from Esther, it is that people who are willing to take risks, who go for the main chance, and who can find ways to work out their own salvation, they will survive. That's, I think, a pretty clear message from Esther. Of course, there's others. It is a very popular book in the Jewish community because it does offer a message of survival hope. And goodness knows, the fate of the Jews had been in the crosshairs of many people, since the time of Esther. I think of the pogroms that occurred during the early Crusades in the 10th and 11th century, the later pogroms that occurred in Eastern Europe, such as Russia, in the 18th and 19th century. And of course, the worst of it all was the Holocaust in the 20th century. Having a book like Esther, in times like that, probably gave people a feeling of a spiritual and moral life ring that they could hold on to. But it is certainly part of the cluster of books that we've looked at, for the last 2 weeks, since we finished our study of Job. At best, God is silent, but provides a framework for people's consideration of what they are willing to undertake, what they are willing to attempt, and what they are willing to think about. But as we get into books like Esther, the role which is set aside for God, is much diminished from what we would have expected if we were just aware of the book of Exodus. So I'm going to leave it at that note and see what thoughts you might have about this book of Esther.